Okay, so I suppose we can start. Today's welcome to all the hardcore Dhamma people. It's good. So today's sutras, I've chosen two sutras, and the reason I've chosen two is because the theme of these two sutras is very closely related to each other. And essentially what these sutras are about, as far as I'm concerned, is are about how to make choices in life. How do we choose things? And I think this is quite important. I just had on Friday night, I had a lady come up here to me and ask me a question after the Dhamma talk, and she was saying that I'm not sure whether I should become a psychologist or whether I should become a counselor. You know, my heart says I should become a counselor. My brain says I should become a psychologist because you get perhaps more recognition and perhaps you get more done that way. So what should I do? So there's always dilemmas in life, and you get into this choice paralysis. You don't know what to do. So this is basically a guide to how to make choices in life. And I talked about this before here, but this sort of gives you the background, the sutta background to these things, which I think is quite interesting here. So the first sutta today is Majjhima Nikāya number 17. Called the Vanapattha Sutta in Pali, the jungle thickets. It's quite a short sutta, and it's quite simple actually, which is nice. It's quite straightforward, but nevertheless, I think it is worthwhile going through this. So, this is how it goes: Vanapattha Sutta. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi, in Jeta's grove Anathapindika's park. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus: "Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir," they replied, and the Blessed One said this: "Bhikkhus, I shall teach you a discourse on jungle thickets. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, Venerable Sir," the bhikkhus replied, and the Blessed One said this: "Here, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu lives in some jungle thicket. While he is living there, his unestablished mindfulness does not become established. His unconcentrated, or if you like, his unstilled mind does not become stilled. His undestroyed taints do not come to destruction. He does not attain the unattained supreme security from bondage. And also the requisites of life that should be obtained by one gone forth: robes, alms food, resting place, and medicinal requisites are hard to come by. The bhikkhu should consider thus: I am living in this jungle thicket. While I am living here, my unestablished mindfulness does not become established, etc., etc. I do not attain the unattained supreme security from bondage. And also the requisites of life are hard to come by. That bhikkhu should depart from that jungle thicket that very night or that very day. He should not continue living there." So, this is then how you make a decision. This is a decision about where you should live, right? You can expand this to look at it in many different ways. If you want to make a decision about where to live, this is how you go about it. Are you making progress in the essential things of the spiritual life? Is your mind becoming clear? Are you becoming mindful? These are like the essential things, right, that drive you on the path. Mindfulness, and from mindfulness comes stillness, the concentration. And then it has here his undestroyed taints. The taints here is the asavas. So these are like the root defilements of the mind, so to speak. Are not destroyed, or in other words, do not come to an end. I think destroyed perhaps is not the best sort of translation here. Destroyed has a kind of almost like a violent sense to it, but it's just the fact that they come to an end, that they stop basically here. And he does not attain the unattained supreme security from bondage. And this can also be translated, I think preferably, as the highest or supreme rest from exertion. You exert yourself, you try to get to the end of the path, you exert yourself, and then when you become an arahant, that is when you actually get the rest from exertion. Yoga kema is the Pali word. Yoga is like, it's the same word as we do for all these exercises in yoga, but in traditional Buddhist or Indian terminology, yoga just means practice or work or exercise that you're doing. And kema means like safety or rest or peace after that. So it's a kind of beautiful expression, the rest from exertion, the unsurpassed rest from exertion, and that's arahantship. So these are all the kind of crucial aspects on the path, starting with mindfulness until full liberation. That's what one lives the holy life for. Particularly if you're a monastic, this is the whole purpose of it. For lay people also, presumably, but maybe a bit more variable among lay people sometimes. But certainly for a monastic, this is the whole purpose. So because of that, if that doesn't happen, what are you doing there? What's going wrong? What should you be doing differently? You need to ask yourself these questions. And if it is the place that is unsuitable, then of course you should leave, because you're not actually succeeding in the whole purpose for why you are there in the first place. No point in staying there anymore. So you depart that very day, that very night. This idea that there's no time to waste, right? The days and nights are relentlessly passing. How well am I spending my time? I'm getting older every day. Who knows how much time I've got? Now is the time to act. So you depart that very day. So this is the crucial issue here, and I think this is something you can expand and you can look at from a very broad kind of angle. It's not just these things, mindfulness, stillness, and arahantship that we're trying to achieve. There are many kind of sub-factors on the path. You try to become more virtuous to begin with. You try to have some sense restraint. You try to develop compassion and kindness. And all of these things are included under wholesome states. And this is what we will see in the next sutta. Actually, it refers to any kind of wholesome state you want to establish. And as long as you're moving in that direction, things are going right. If you're not moving in that direction, then you need to ask yourself whether you can do something differently. So this is how to make decisions on the spiritual path. And then the second one here. Here, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu lives in some jungle thicket. While he is living there, his unestablished mindfulness does not become established. His unconcentrated mind does not become concentrated. His unended corruptions do not come to an end, and he does not attain the unattained supreme rest from exertion. Yet the requisites of life that should be obtained by one gone forth, that is, the robes, the alms food, the resting place, and the medicinal requisites, they are easy to come by. That bhikkhu should consider thus: I am living in this jungle thicket. While I'm living here, my unestablished mindfulness does not become established. I do not get stillness. I do not get the unattained supreme rest from exertion. Yet the requisites of life that should be obtained by one gone forth are easy to come by. However, I did not go forth from home life into homelessness for the sake of robes, alms food, resting place, and medicinal requisites. Moreover, while I am living here, my unestablished mindfulness, etc., does not become established. I do not attain the unattained rest from exertion. Having reflected thus, that bhikkhu should depart from that jungle thicket. He should not continue living there. So this is about getting your priorities right? What is your priorities in life? What do we actually really want to achieve? And of course, the more committed you are to a spiritual path or to the Buddhist teachings, the more that becomes your priority, the actual spiritual teachings. So when you ask yourself a question, how should I decide in this particular circumstance? Then you tend to decide with whatever gives rise to the more the faster progress on the spiritual path, the more wholesome states, etc. So this is about a lesson in priorities, essentially. So you remember these things. So, and of course the purpose of the robes, alms food, and resting place, and medicinal requisites as it says here, it's not because of that one goes forward. In fact, they are just supports, right? They are the supports for living the holy life. And the supports shouldn't become the main issue here. Okay, next one here. Here, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu lives in some jungle thicket. While he is living there, his unestablished mindfulness becomes established. His unconstant or his unstilled mind becomes stilled. His unended defilements come to an end, and he attains the unattained supreme rest from exertion. Yet the requisites of life that should be obtained by one gone forth, the robes, alms, food, resting place, and medicinal requisites, are hard to come by. The bhikkhu should consider thus: I am living in this jungle thicket. While I am living here, my unestablished mindfulness, it says here, has become established. I have attained the unattained supreme security from bondage. Yet the requisites of life are hard to come by. However, I did not go forth from the home life into homelessness for the sake of robes, alms, food, resting place, and medicinal requisites. Moreover, while I am living here, my unestablished mindfulness has become established. I have attained the unattained supreme security from bondage. Having reflected thus, that bhikkhu should continue living in that jungle thicket. He should not depart. So here again, you see the priorities. The priorities is that you are making progress in the spiritual life. That is what really matters. Everything else is secondary. If you have enough requisites so that progress in the spiritual life can happen, then that's good enough. You don't need any more requisites. The requisites are not the main point. So if you have enough and you're making progress, then it's fine. However, if the requisites are so sparse that you stop making progress, then of course, then you have a problem. And then you may have to move because you are actually not fulfilling what you want to fulfill there. I should point out that there is a slight translation problem here. It says here that while I am living here, my unestablished mindfulness has become established. Actually, that is probably not the best translation. The best translation would be something like, while I am living here, my unestablished mindfulness gets established. In other words, there's a process. The process is happening here. You're actually moving towards these states. So it's not so much that it has been established, because then you have almost like reached the goal. And this becomes even more pronounced in the last one, where it says, I have attained the unattained supreme rest from exertion. Well, actually, if you have attained that, it doesn't really matter where you live so much anymore, because you have reached the end of the holy life. So again, the point is that I am attaining, in other words, I'm in the process of attaining the unattained supreme rest from exertion. So all of these are showing that you are moving in the right direction, not that you have actually gotten to the end goal yet. And then you should stay there. You should not depart. That is the conclusion in that case. Next one. Here, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu lives in some jungle thicket. While he is living there, his unestablished mindfulness becomes established. His unstilled mind becomes stilled. His unended defilements come to an end. He attains the unattained supreme rest from exertion, and also the requisites of life that should be obtained by one gone forth, the robes, alms, food, resting place, and medicinal requisites are easy to come by. The bhikkhu should consider thus: I am living in this jungle thicket. While I am living here, my unestablished mindfulness is getting established. I am attaining the unattained supreme rest from exertion, and also the requisites of life are easy to come by. That bhikkhu should continue living in that jungle thicket as long as life lasts. He should not depart. Of course, he should continue living there as long as life lasts, only if he continues to improve, right? If at some stage the improvement stops, and for some reason, then he may have to reconsider that. But as long as that improvement is there, that's how long he should stay there. Okay, next one. And now we are moving on to just exactly the same thing, but he's living in dependence on different things. In the first one, he lived in dependence of a jungle thicket. Then now he's living in dependence on a certain village, on a certain town, and a certain city, and a certain country. And I have checked this and compared this with the Chinese translation of the same sutta, in the Madhyama Agama, and the living in dependence on a certain city and a certain country is not actually found in the Chinese. So it seems like to be, perhaps it is slightly expanded in the Pali. It's very easy to fit in more categories because it's just a list of things, basically. And some people have pointed out that perhaps even living in dependence upon a village or a town may also have been inserted there. Possibly, because it is like a list that is expanding. The original ideal, it seems, from the suttas of monastic life was to live in the forest, and you wouldn't normally actually live in the village, which seems to be the point of this particular expansion here, that you're actually living in the village. That seems to possibly have been a later development, and may have been, perhaps, this is speculation, I have to admit, this is certainly no absolute proof of this can possibly be made, but it may have been an expansion later on. And then we have the last one. Here, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu lives in dependence upon a certain person. And again, the qualities that he is seeking for, the mindfulness, the stillness, and the destruction of the defilements, do not come to destruction. And the requisites are hard to come by. That very night, that very day, that bhikkhu should depart from that person without taking leave. He should not continue following him. Okay, so this is slightly more interesting, because here we're talking about somebody living in dependence on a certain person, and it may look from the listing here that dependence may be a dependence in terms of alms, food, or requisites, or whatever. But I think that this actually means dependence in the sense of taking somebody as a teacher, because it says here you shouldn't continue following him, right? You don't follow after somebody who gives you requisites. That is quite, I never heard of that before anyway. So the person you follow after is obviously a teacher, right? Your teacher moves, so you might follow after him because he's your teacher. So I think the meaning here is that it's a teacher. So even a teacher should be evaluated in exactly the same way here. Is it working? Am I making progress under this teacher? Or is this teacher perhaps hindering my progress by giving me strange teachings and leading me astray? Or maybe there's a personality clash, or for whatever the reason might be. That is because the purpose, again, of the holy life is always to make progress. If you're not making progress, the whole thing is pointless. And that's why you need to do something here. So even to the point where you choose your teacher wisely here. So it's good not to become too attached to a teacher, otherwise you may not be able to make the right choice. Okay, so you should depart, notice here, without taking leave. It's interesting. Why does it say without taking leave? It seems a bit rude, right? If you have a teacher, you depart without taking leave. And I think the reason might be, and this is, you have to understand the monastic vinaya a little bit, that one of the duties of a monastic teacher is to look after you and to make sure that you have enough requisites. So if your monastic teacher, or whoever it is, does not look after you properly and doesn't ensure that you have the requisites of life, then you have no obligation, it seems, from this to actually depart. To excuse yourself or to take leave before you actually go. And you will see this one. This is the contrast between this one and the next one here. The next one here is, here bhikkhus, a bhikkhu lives in dependence upon a certain person. And again, exactly the same thing. His mindfulness and all these things do not become established. But in this case, he does get the requisites. And then he thinks, having reflected thus, that bhikkhu should depart from that person after taking leave. He should not continue following him. So in this case, because that teacher has at least looked after you to the best of their ability, you should take leave and say, sorry, I got to go somewhere else, and that's okay. Then we have the third category here of this scheme. So the bhikkhu lives dependence upon a certain person. In this case, his mindfulness and all the qualities do become established, but he is not obtaining the requisites. And then he thinks, as before, well, I didn't really become a monk or a nun, or you could perhaps apply the same thing to lay life if you, in a kind of extended way. I did not become any of these things to obtain requisites. I did this to actually obtain spiritual qualities. So, having reflected thus, he should continue following that person. He should not depart from him. I find this reflection very, very useful. It is the kind of thing which sometimes it's so easy to look upon the people around us and see faults and see problems and see things which aren't quite right. This is just the nature of things, and our relationships with other people tend to go in waves, right? They go up and down. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not so good. But you shouldn't make any rash decision just because you are not getting on maybe all that well at the moment. You shouldn't make any rash decisions about leaving. I'm fed up, I'm going to leave, that's it. If you do that, you're missing the point. You should actually ask yourself instead, am I improving in wholesome qualities? That is the right way of looking at whether you should stay with that person or not. So it takes away some of the emotional reasons for doing things, right? Sometimes we act on kind of raw emotions in a very irrational way. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't act on emotions sometimes. Sometimes we are all very emotional beings, right? Emotions often drive our lives. But we should be careful to check those emotions sometimes, because sometimes they are just off the track, going in the wrong way. Yeah? Okay, so then we have the last case. Here, bhikkhus, a bhikkhu lives in dependence on a certain person, and this time, of course, the mindfulness and everything becomes established, and he has the requisites. And then comes the nice line at the bottom here, which I really like. That bhikkhu should continue following that person as long as life lasts. He should not depart from him, even if told to go away. That's one of my favorite lines in this is really great, because it shows you that, again, what is the purpose of all this? The purpose is to improve spiritually. If you are improving spiritually, you are in the right place, right? So if your teacher says, maybe it's time for you to go, you just stay and see what happens instead. And then it might just, because you don't know why the teacher said that, maybe there was some misunderstanding or something going on. But if you are improving, you are in the right place. So you just, like one monk said many years ago about Bodhinyana monastery, he said that, well, if I get kicked out, I'll chain myself to the front gate of the monastery here. That is the kind of a similar kind of idea. So you stay there because you are fulfilling the purpose for the monastic life. That is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. So there you are. So that is, I love this sutta because it makes it so clear the basis on which we should make decisions in life, what is really important. And it's so common for people to be confused about decision making. It's so nice to have one very clear guideline for how to make decisions in life. And this can be used, of course, for all the big decisions we have to do, things like where we should live, who we should have as our teacher, what kind of job we should have perhaps, or should I be a monastic, or whatever it is. Whatever decision, down to the very small ones of daily life, everything can come within the scope of this particular way of thinking. And it takes away all the silly reasons that we often have for making decisions. Will my career prosper? Will I be popular? And all these kind of things. Sometimes it's basically irrelevant whether your career prospers. I mean, it's fine if it does, but it doesn't necessarily matter so much if you are improving spiritually, right? It depends, again, how committed you are to the spiritual path. What is really important to you? What actually matters? At the end of your life, what are you going to really be happy with? And I think most people that I know would say, when I die, what I will be really happy with is my personal qualities, what I have built up in life, how I feel about myself. Very few people say, "I wish I had spent more time at the office," when they die. And this is just the way where things usually are. So, so please. So I personally have used this. It's a very simple teaching, and sometimes I find the simplest teachings in the suttas are the most powerful ones. They really, something like that can be so incredibly useful sometimes. Anyway, so let's move on to the next sutta. This is a much longer sutta, but it's the principles in the sutta are exactly the same. So we don't actually need to go through it in great detail. And I won't go through it in great detail because that would be very involved. I'm going to sort of skip over sections which have been explained before here, which I think I explained only a few weeks ago, some of these things. No, it's 114, right? Majjhima 114. The Sevitabbāsevitabba Sutta, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. So, and this sutta, what it really does, it shows you that the ideas in the sutta we just saw can be expanded to pretty much include all circumstances. This is how it goes. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied, the Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, I shall teach you a discourse on what should be cultivated and what should not be cultivated. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say. Yes, Venerable Sir, the bhikkhus replied, the Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, bodily conduct is of two kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. And bodily conduct is either the one or the other. Verbal conduct is of two kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. And verbal conduct is either the one or the other. Mental conduct is of two kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated, either one or the other. Inclination of the mind is either to be cultivated or not to be cultivated, either one or the other. The acquisition of perception is of two kinds, to be cultivated, not to be cultivated, either one or the other. The acquisition of views or view is of two kinds, to be cultivated or not to be cultivated, either one or the other. The acquisition of individuality is of two kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. And the acquisition of individuality is either one or the other. So that is the exposition. And then we have the Venerable Sariputta, who then expands on this exposition. And he says then, Venerable Sir, I understand the detailed meaning of the Blessed One's utterance, which he has spoken in brief without expounding the detailed meaning, to be thus. And then he gives the detailed meaning. And I'm not going to go too much into the detailed meaning, because these details are fleshed out also elsewhere in the suttas, at least many of them, and they're not... there's nothing really all that new to these things. So basically, when it comes to the bodily action that is to be cultivated, that is just the three types of bodily unwholesome action we talk about in the suttas all the time: the destruction of life, the stealing, and sexual misconduct. And the opposite then, of course, is the good actions. That's really all it is. So it fleshes it out like that. And one is to be cultivated, the other one is not, obviously. So in this case, I think it's very obvious that must be the case. It's not very hard to see what is going on here. The same thing is true for speech. It just divides the speech up into the four types of speech: lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, and idle speech. Right? And the opposite. And remember, again, that we're talking about opposites here. We're talking about either the negative or the opposite, which is abandoning the negative and doing the positive, right? So this is always this double meaning of virtue in Buddhism, not doing the bad and doing the good at the same time. And then we have the unwholesome states of mind. And I'm losing track a little bit where I am now. Okay, so this is paragraph 7 that we come to now. So this is then the 2 types of bad conduct of mind, is the covetousness or the greed, particularly the greed you have for the possession of others, right? This is the kind of meaning that covetousness usually has. You read the Bible, the 10 Commandments, it says something like, thou shalt not covet the property of thy neighbor, or something like that. I've never read the Bible in English, but I think something like that. And this is a similar kind of thing, not coveting the property of others. And then the last one is not having mental state of ill will, wishing the harm of other beings, but actually having the opposite of ill will, and which is metta. And this is quite nice, because this tells you, this is like one of the root meanings of metta as given in the suttas. And it says here, specifically it says, he has a mind without ill will, and he has intentions free from hate. Thus, may these beings be free from enmity, affliction, and anxiety. May they live happily here. Such mental conduct causes unwholesome states to diminish and wholesome states to increase in one who cultivates them. So there you have the root meaning of metta, I think, in the suttas, the opposite of ill will. And there are chants in Buddhism that have been devoted to that particular paragraph, and you chant that paragraph. So that is the mental conduct. And again, I think in this case it is very clear why one is wholesome and one is unwholesome. We don't really need to discuss it that much further. So you need to develop one and abandon the other one. And then we have another aspect here. This is now the inclination of mind, is of 2 kinds, paragraph 8. And this too, the inclination of mind too, is to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. And the inclination of mind is very similar to intention. It is about inclination of mind which is imbued with basically covetousness, he has here, or perhaps greed, ill will, and lastly cruelty, it says here, which might be better to translate as harming or something like that. So these are the inclinations of mind. And the opposite then, the good inclination of mind, is the opposite 3, right? When you have freedom from these things. And this idea of inclination of mind is actually something that you see in a number of texts in the suttas, and it's an interesting idea, because what inclination of mind seems to mean is where your mind generally tends to incline. Let's say you go back home in the evening, you rest, you feel at peace. Now, what is the general state of mind if it is neither really upset nor particularly happy about anything? Your kind of neutral state of mind, if you like, where it generally tends to go back to. And that state you have, that is your inclination of mind, that kind of natural state that you tend to have. Of course, we all get upset sometimes, we all get kind of elated sometimes, but that is not really the issue. What is the general inclination of the mind? And this is an important point, because that inclination itself needs to be developed, and that inclination should always be towards positive things. So when you come back home and you rest, and you feel good inside of yourself, you feel a sense of, compassion for others and goodness, then the inclination is going in the right direction. And this is talked about in particular in the Vanapattha Sutta, the 2 kinds of thought, number 19 of the Majjhima Nikaya. Then we have, what do we have then? Perception is the next one, paragraph 9. And perceptions are of 2 kinds. So again, this kind again is about the perceptions that are imbued with or excuse me, that have ill will or greed or harming in them, and then the perceptions are the opposite, that don't have ill will or desire or harming in them. And again, perception, the reason why perception is there, I think, because perception is a very foundational thing in Buddhism. Perception is how we see the world, right? It's a very immediate thing. When you sit back, the way you see the world is it happens automatically. It's not something that you have much control over. You see the world in a certain way. It's your your natural tendencies, a bit like the inclination of mind before. And that perception then has a tendency to affect everything, how we live our lives, our intentions, our thoughts, our views, everything else. So we need to learn to look at the world in a new way. How can we look at the world in a way whereby we can be more forgiving, we can have more compassion, we can have more understanding of other people? Is there a way I can change the way I look at things? And by learning, by developing your perception, important part of this practice, you actually learn to change the way you see things. And this is very important. And I'm always reminded of the sutta I was reading in the Anguttara Nikaya a while back, which when I read it, I thought this was very interesting. I didn't really perhaps understand it straight away, as it often can be with the suttas. But that sutta was when somebody comes to the Buddha or comes to the Venerable Sariputta and they ask, what is the difference between someone who does attain Nibbana, who reaches awakening, and someone who doesn't? What is the reason why one person does reach awakening and somebody doesn't? And the answer was that if it's someone who understands that certain perceptions lead down, certain perceptions lead to stability, certain perceptions lead to improvement, certain perceptions lead to, I think it's distinction there, which means like high states of samadhi, and certain perceptions lead to penetration, like deep insight. The person who understands those perceptions that lead to those various things as they actually are, that is the person who will reach awakening. If you don't understand perceptions in that way, you will not be able to attain awakening. So in other words, you know inside of your mind, now I have a perception that leads downwards. Now I have a perception that leads upwards. And then you train and you develop those perceptions that lead up, that lead to distinction, samadhi, and to penetration eventually. Those are the perceptions that you train. So you're changing the way you look at the world. You're changing the way you react and you engage with the world. So this, of course, this can be done, right? This is one of the things we do by learning a bit of metta meditation. We're learning to change our perceptions, look at people differently, think about things in a new way here. So that is the perceptions. Again, it's fairly obvious why it is included here, because one obviously is unwholesome and one is not. So one will therefore lead away from awakening, from mindfulness, from samadhi, from any kind of wholesome state, while the other one will lead towards the wholesome states. Then in paragraph 10 we have views. And it's fascinating here, it's about what is normally considered right view according to the Noble Eightfold Path, what they call the mundane or ordinary right view, which is the idea of having a idea of rebirth and karma and these things, that there are beings in the world who have attained awakening and see the world rightly. That is considered right view in Buddhism. And then there's opposite, the view that you don't believe in karma, you don't believe in rebirth, you don't think there is any such thing. You don't think that there are beings who have actually seen anything worthwhile seeing. Of course, if you don't think that, then there is no starting point on the Buddhist path, because it means you can never have faith or confidence in the Buddha as a teacher. So that is just the ordinary right view. And it's interesting because it may not be obvious, but again, one of these views lead to the developing the wholesome and the other one does not. Presumably this has to do with to some extent being a bit worried about retributions in future life, but also a little bit about seeing the pointlessness of this going around and round in samsara, and actually wondering, why am I doing this? Maybe it's a time to get off this wheel altogether here. Okay, then we have the last one here in this section, and this is about the acquisition of individuality, it says here, and this essentially means rebirth. And so this is again of two kinds. And the point here is that if you do acquire a certain type of rebirth, and this can be the rebirth, of course, in the very painful realms, like an animal, for example, or some other painful state of existence, then there isn't much you can do to cultivate what is good. You're trapped, essentially. Particularly if you're an animal, you are deluded, your mind isn't clear, you don't know what you're doing, you're just kind of roaming around randomly. and nothing much you can do to get out of that. So you're trapped. You're kind of locked inside this body, which doesn't allow you to think in these ways. Or this could also mean getting reborn in one of these very high Deva worlds, the God, the very happy worlds, where you live for eons and eons and eons, having an incredibly good time, but not really being able to do anything which moves you in any direction, right? So you're stuck again in a certain way. And this is what the Buddha said. He said all these beings that are in these divine abidings, in a very high, they are basically stuck. He actually says that in other suttas. So you want to be born in a place where you have the possibility of doing something positive. And they often say that the human realm might be one of the best places to be reborn. And I think that's probably true because, we have we can certainly see suffering in this life. It's not that hard to see that as a human being. And at the same time, we have the ability to change things. We have a lot of room to maneuver, to do things differently. So I think it may not be the only place where one can practice a spiritual path, but it certainly is a good one. So to use this opportunity is always, I think, very wise. I'm not exactly sure why this last thing is in here, whether it means that we should aspire for human rebirth or for a particular rebirth in the future. I'm not sure about exactly why it is here. Maybe that is the point, that we should aspire for a rebirth where it is suitable to practice, but I am not entirely sure. Or maybe it just means that we should use our human existence to the best of our ability here. That might also be part of the meaning of this. Anyway, there's one interesting thing I didn't say about this sutta, and that is that it doesn't have any parallel in the Chinese agamas, in the other scriptures anywhere else. So it only really exists in the Pali. But it exists, there are similar suttas in the Anguttara Nikaya, and those suttas in Anguttara Nikaya, they do actually have parallels in the Chinese. So there are many of the aspects of this sutta which has parallels, so the general principle is still valid. But maybe not all of these qualities are mentioned in some of the other parallels. Okay, so that is the first one, the first part, and I think in this case it is pretty clear what is going on. It's pretty clear why some things are to be cultivated and others not. But now we get to the places where it is not so clear-cut and where one needs to be more alert as to what is the right way of going about things. And this is the second exposition. It's a paragraph 22 now I'm going to go on to. And here the Buddha says the following: Sariputta, forms cognizable by the eye are of two kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. Sounds cognizable by the ear are of two kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. Odors cognizable by the nose are of two kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. Flavors cognizable by the tongue are of two kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. Tangibles cognizable by the body are of two kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. Mind objects cognizable by the eye are of two kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. And then, of course, the Venerable Sariputta then explains what the Buddha means by this. And of course, it is exactly the same pattern as we've been seeing before, and that is that any form that you see with the eye that increases the good states, increases the wholesome states, and here it specifically uses wholesome states. It doesn't just say mindfulness or stillness or whatever. Any sight that causes the wholesome to increase and the unwholesome to diminish, that is a sight to be cultivated. Any sight that decreases the wholesome and increases the unwholesome is a sight to be avoided. So again, you think, well, what are the wholesome things that are good to see? And some things in life have a tendency to create upset, right? Negativity, anger, or many, many sides in our society today are conducive to desire. I mean, the whole industry is out there who basically just want to create desires in you, so you can go do more shopping and keep the economy afloat and all these kind of things. And of course, this is where we have to be careful. These are the places, particularly very strong desires, which can arise in certain contexts. And that is, of course, why, as a monk, this has to do with sampajanya. Sampajanya is what comes in the gradual training after sense restraint. You try to restrain the senses, and then once the senses are reasonably restrained, so that you don't have too much desire, too much anger arising, then you have to have sampajanya, which means clear comprehension. And a large part of sampajanya, and this is explained in the Thickets Sutta in Majjhima number 2, a large part of that is about knowing, basically just where to go and where not to go. It says in there you should avoid certain things, right? You should use certain things in the right way. You should avoid certain things. Like, let me just have a quick look, so I don't give you completely misleading information. But avoiding is one thing. Avoiding, enduring, and using. So, and of course, avoiding is one thing. And as a monastic, you don't usually go to Northbridge on a Friday night, right? You avoid certain places. And because you know that if you go there, you don't go to the casino, or you don't go to anywhere which can give rise to these unwholesome states. So you try you understand that you don't put yourself in a dangerous position. You don't need to test yourself. Sometimes people say, "Oh, it's good to test yourself sometimes," but to be, my personal feeling is that there's enough tests just being alive in this world. It's not as if you need to put yourself in a kind of difficult situation to increase the difficulty of things. There's always plenty of testing opportunities, even when you live in a monastery. So basically that is part of sampajanya. Avoid things that should be avoided, that puts you in a difficult situation. Endure. Enduring is the same thing again. It's about, we know that sometimes difficult things happen in life. So we learn, we think, okay, today I can be almost absolutely sure somebody is going to say something I don't quite like sometime during this day. This is just the way things are. So you understand that these things will happen. And when you understand that they will happen, that it's nothing you can control, then you just endure, you're just patient. And you have a sense of understanding instead of getting upset, right? Similar kind of thing, sampajanya, about forms cognizable by the eye. So you avoid them to the best of ability. If you can't avoid them, then you learn to endure, which is a kind of avoiding, I suppose, in a certain way. So these then are, you understand which things actually lead to the wholesome and which don't, in terms of all the 6 senses. And that, of course, is quite all-encompassing and quite broad. So then we come to the last section of this sutta, the third exposition, and this is very similar to the exposition that we saw before. It's almost exactly the same as the exposition we saw in Majjhima Nikaya 17. And so here again the Buddha says, Sariputta, this is paragraph 39 in case you lost. Sariputta, robes are of 2 kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. Alms food is of 2 kinds, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. Resting places are of 2 kinds, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. Villages are of 2 kinds, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. Towns, cities, districts, persons are of 2 kinds, I say, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. So now you can see here, this is a slight expansion on what we had in the first sutta. Here you talk about the 4 requisites, the robes, the alms food, the resting places. And you know what is suitable for you in all these circumstances. What is it? What food? What resting place will give rise to better states in you, and what don't? And then you look inside of yourself, you come to find out these things, which ones actually work and which one don't work, and then you act in accordance with that. Again, it's all to do with clear comprehension. And here you can see this expansion. It's about anything which is unwholesome, not just the mindfulness, etc. we're seeing before. So, and some of these things are, you might think that they are, may seem trivial. You have, for example, the robes here, for example, are of two kinds, to be cultivated and not to be cultivated. And you might think, when you look at me, you might think, well, what's the big deal? You have been wearing this brown sheet. Surely, how can there be so much about being cultivated, not cultivated? It's such a simple robe anyway. But the reality is, of course, that sometimes when you're a monastic, even the simple things, because that's all you have, you sort of get into that, and you want robes of a certain kind, you want requisites of a certain kind. And that is when you get into the desire, right? The desire element. You start thinking of these things in terms of what you want, rather than what purpose they have in your monastic life. And of course, you can think like that as a layperson as well. You can think, well, why am I wearing these particular clothes? Is it because I, have a lot of desire for them, or I'm attached to them, or is it just because they do their function in a sense? And you can think like that, at the very least. And the same is then true of all the other ones, just like before. So there you are, and then you can, of course, expand this sutta, if you like, to basically include any situation in your life, whatever you like. It is expandable almost endlessly into any situation. So you can see the general principle here, how it actually works. So a great piece of advice. And how great is this advice comes out in the last section here, the conclusion section here, paragraph 60. Where the Buddha says, Sariputta, if all the nobles, these are the Khattiyas, one of the castes in India, understood thus the detailed meaning of my utterance, which I spoke in brief, it would lead to their welfare and happiness for a long time. If all the Brahmins, all the merchants, these are the third caste, all the workers, these are the lowest caste, understood thus the meaning of my utterance, which I spoke in brief, it would lead to their welfare and happiness for a long time. If the world with its gods, its maras, its brahmas, this generation with its recluses and brahmins, its devas and its people, understood thus the meaning of my utterance, which I spoke in brief, it would lead to the welfare and happiness of the world for a long time. So basically anybody can use this. That's what he's saying here. He doesn't sort of restrict it to anyone at all. So anybody can use this teaching. That is what the Blessed One said. The Venerable Sariputta was satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. So there you are about decision making, and the very rare occasion of finish before time is almost unheard of. So, does anybody have any questions? Anything? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Talking about a smell sensation, just taking that one. If something's a wholesome smell, you have to discern this is wholesome, and this will lead to a good outcome. Yeah. So if I smell a beautiful, pie baking, well, that may make desire come up to have or whatever. Yeah. If I smell, decayed flowers, then that's unwholesome. So it's not so black and white.
Yeah. It basically, I think you're asking about what exactly sort of is wholesome and unwholesome here, and whether it's evil or good or what exactly.
It's not a duality.
Yeah. It's not really. It's not often not a duality. Often it's like a continuum. It's like more or less wholesome, right? And this is one of the interesting things that the Buddha actually mentions in some suttas. He says that there is karma which is dark, that is bright. That's where, if it's dark, it's really bad, pretty bad. If it's bright, it's really, really good, right? Pure heart. But there's all the thing in between, which is both black and white, and leads to both black and white results. So there's this whole spectrum of karma, from very bad to very good. And the way you know that is the way you know whether something is unwholesome. You look inside of yourself. How many defilements are present in your mind? How much is there anger there, or is there a sense of compassion, understanding, acceptance? Is there strong desire, or is there a sense of peace instead? Desire is got to get something. The opposite is peace, right? You feel at ease. You have renounced that desire, renounced that object. So what is your mental state like? That's how you know wholesome or unwholesome. And the less you have of the defilements, the less you have of the hindrances, if you like, the more wholesome your mind state is, and the more you're going in the right direction. So yeah, but it's not, as you say, absolutely black and white. There's a whole lot of stuff going on there. Yeah. Okay, very good. Okay, thank you, Christina. Does anybody else have any questions before I move on to the ones from... Anybody else want to ask anything here? Yeah? Okay, silence, complete silence. Okay. I guess it's a fairly obvious sutta. Maybe there isn't that much to say about it, which is good, because sometimes it's too... sometimes, it gets too complicated. It's nice to have a simple sutta now and again who gives very clear and concise advice. I find that very useful myself. Okay, so then let's take. This is 2 questions from overseas, and this is from Ludovic from Taiwan. Hello, Ludovic. I know you. I know who you are. So nice to hear from you. So what Ludovic is asking here. Ludovic stayed at the monastery for the rains retreat 1 year, so I know him quite well. Asking, Bhante, could you give us some hints of how to change and develop the right inclination of mind? Okay. Well, basically, the whole practice of the Eightfold Path is obviously about developing the right inclination of mind, right? So when you, just by keeping precept, just by being kind, you already develop the inclination of mind. It's almost when you know that you cannot kill a living being, when you start to help living beings, when you start to be kind and compassionate, you're actually encouraging that side of your personality. It happens almost automatically because you're looking to be kind and you're looking to avoid cruelty and harm. So it happens almost by default when you do these things. Or when you want to speak nice words, it's very hard to speak nice words if you feel angry, right? So by the very fact that you're trying to speak nice words means that you are inclining your mind in a new direction. That very trying is actually enough. So by doing that, you're already doing the right thing. And of course, when it comes to thinking, and we're trying to think with metta, trying to think with compassion, part of that is doing the metta practice, right? Doing metta practice is essentially about learning to see the good in other beings. You're trying to see the good, understand them, forgive them for what they have done. And when you do that, again, you're changing the inclination of your mind. So all of these things are about changing inclination. You're learning new ways of seeing things. It's very closely related to perception and to seeing the world in a different way. And gradually, your mind changes. You can maybe start off as a person who is a bit depressed, and over the years you see your mind lighten up, brighten up, become more and more light, and you see the negativity. Depression is just seeing the negativity in the world, right? Seeing the bad all the time. You start to see the good instead. You start to see things in a different way. You're practicing changing your mind. So this is all about that. And of course, in daily life, you walk around, you see people, you can think of people as bad or evil, they're doing the wrong thing. Or you can try to understand why they're doing what they're doing. Use the idea of non-self. If there is no self, if we all are like these boats on the ocean who sort of blow around with the prevailing winds, we are conditioned beings. And how can you blame somebody if they're conditioned? How can you blame them for doing stupid things if they have been conditioned to do that? You can't blame so much anymore. You become more forgiving. You become more understanding of where people are at. You realize that the first victim of their bad action is themselves. It's not you. They are much more a bad victim, much more of a victim. And then when you think like that, you can actually have compassion and kindness instead of getting upset. And all of these things are ways of changing the inclination of the mind. And you will notice inside of yourself that your neutral general state of mind will gradually improve, right? But it takes work, and this is the spiritual path. It's not difficult, it's not like a mathematical equation or anything like that. You don't have to be super smart to do this, but you have to put in the work. That's what matters. Question number 2. What is it the same person? I'm not sure. This might be some other person. Anyway, it doesn't matter. What do we do if we cannot go to another teacher, one with whom we can progress? Sometimes, especially for nuns, there is very little choice. In this case, is it better to be a lay person? One of the things is, and this is, I think, one of the things you always have to keep in mind, is that no matter who you are staying with, no matter what teacher you are living in dependence on, your final teacher is always the Buddha, right? So you always have a teacher there. The Buddha is always there. You can always go to the suttas. You can always find inspiration in the suttas. And this is the wonderful thing, is that is there, everything is there. So the person you stay with in dependence on is not quite as important as perhaps it was at the time of the Buddha, when whether you chose the Buddha or you chose somebody else would actually make a major impact. But today, because you have the Buddha, it may not matter so much if that nun or monk or lay teacher, or whoever it is you're staying with, is awakened or not. It may not be that important. Of course, it helps. It's very nice to have an inspiring example around you, but even if you can't find that, you have the word of the Buddha. So what you do then is if you live in a monastic community with nuns, I don't know if you are a nun or if you are aspiring to be a nun or thinking about it or what, but if you do, then if it is a good community, at least, it has a good community feel, and it gives you the supports for practicing properly, it gives you a nice kuti, secluded in the forest, it's a good community with a good feeling to it, and it's a supportive environment in many ways, then it will be a good place to stay, regardless. Right? So you have to try it out, you have to see whether it works. Is it better to stay as a layperson? It's impossible to make any absolute judgments about that. Perhaps in some situation it is. It's hard to say. But generally speaking, I would say the monastic life was laid down by the Buddha because it is the ideal vehicle for practicing the spiritual path, right? It has many advantages to live the monastic life. You get a nice kuti in the forest by yourself. You have a lot of time on your own. You don't have all the worries and things you have to do in lay life. You have a kalyana mittas around you which are going in roughly the same direction all the time. You don't have to deal with all the people who are doing exactly the opposite of you and justify your existence to everybody else. Everybody accepts what you're doing. One of the wonderful things about being a monk is that you travel around the world, and wherever you go, people treat you almost always kindly and nicely and in a friendly way. Not absolutely always, sometimes they yell after you, but most of the time they treat you very well. So there are great benefits in living the monastic life. So I would recommend it, but the best thing to do is to simply try it out. Go to a monastery, stay there for a while, see what you feel like, what it feels like. Is it conducive for you or not? And then take it from there. That's probably the best thing to do. But remember, and this I think is a very important point, the final teacher must always be the Buddha. If we haven't got the Buddha, everything becomes very rudderless. One teacher may sound very impressive, another may sound very impressive, and yet they may teach things which collide with each other. So how do you decide? You have to go back to the Buddha, basically. So, those were the 2 questions. Anybody else have any comments before we call it a day? Everybody happy? Yeah. Okay, everybody seems happy, so let's pay our respects to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha.